Alright, in this video we're going to use a grid instancer and a modifier to create an explosion or a firework effect. We're going to use spheres in this tutorial and we're going to apply some illuminance to those spheres to get this explosion effect. And then we're also going to mess around with the camera presets. We can change just a few settings in our camera presets to get the desired effect that we want. And for the animations I will be using keyframing. And this may be blasphemy for you Final Cut Pro users, but I'm going to be using ScreenFlow for my post-production to add audio and to mess around with the video a little bit more to change its length. You can pick up this project file from www.bcraftmath.com/mo2. You will see two versions in that folder. Tutorial number 4, Explosion, you're going to see a capsule project and then you will also see a explosion sphere. The one that I'm using in this tutorial will be with spheres, but I do have one made with capsules as well. You will notice that the sizes are a little bit different in each one, but when it's all said and done, we're still getting the same effect. I've also included the exported movie from Apple Motion as well as the post-production, if you will, from ScreenFlow, and then the explosion audio. I just threw something together real quick in GarageBand for the sake of this tutorial. So inside of Apple Motion, I have a duration of 4 seconds, 30 frames per second. This is a quick animation. I'm going to go ahead and load up MO2. Hide the project pane. Hide the timeline. Make my keyframe window a little bit smaller. And I'm going to fit the canvas to the window. Inside of the inspector for MO2, I'm going to go ahead and add that sphere. So Model, Primitives, Sphere. And what motivated this tutorial here, a user did ask me about one of the instancer presets. So if we go to Add Model and we come down here to Instancer Presets, you're going to have a particle burst. And you can see the preview right there in that little thumbnail right there. So we're going to create something similar to that, but we're going to animate this thing. And you could essentially add this instancer preset here and do the proper animations and you can get the same effect. But I want to show you how we can kind of dissect this thing and build one ourselves. We can do this relatively quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and add an instancer and I'm going to do a grid. Let's go ahead and drop that sphere into that instancer. And this is going to look crazy for right now, but we'll fix that right here in a moment. As a matter of fact, for our sphere, let's just go and drop this radius down. I'm going to use the scale later, but for now, I'm just going to drop this radius down to something relatively small, like 0.05. So now we have some small spheres. Clicking on my instancer, I want to bump up the count of this. And I'm going to leave it on grid and iterate for right now. But the instancer count, let's bump this on up to 15 on the X, 15 on the Y, and 15 on the Z. Switch over to perspective, zoom on out, we have a cube of spheres. And it's kind of hard to see them right now. Let me just come and select my camera, but there's all of our spheres. Now you could come back to your instancer and you could adjust the spacing between them, the grid size, but for here I don't need to do that, and I'm just fine by using 3. This animation is going to be so fast, you're not even going to notice that it's a cube to begin with, and you're not even going to be able to tell about all of this spacing. And now comes to the point where we want to add our modifier. So let's add instancer modifier and let's do a random. And by default, this modifier is going to have a scale applied to it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to leave that. And for the shape settings, I'm going to apply an infinite. So now we're having various scale sizes to our particles, to these spheres here. But what I want to do is I want to create an explosion effect. So I want these things to spread out and I want to scale this instancer to create that effect. Well, to give this more of a spherical explosion, you may say, okay, well, let's come here and modify the rotation. And modifying the rotation isn't really doing anything for me right now. And here is why. If I set this rotation X to 360 degrees, we don't even see anything change over here. Well, here's why. What we want to do is we want to come back to this sphere and I want to put this sphere inside of a null, and it's still going to be in my instancer, but then with the sphere inside of that null, we're going to adjust the Y position. And when we do this, you're going to see that these spheres are going to start rotating around the X-axis. Let me show you what I mean. Let me add a null. I'm going to take that sphere, drop it inside of the null. And now the sphere is no longer in our instancer because we have it in this null. But if I take this entire null, drop it into the instancer, and we don't see any changes. So let's come to the sphere, this one single item that we are using in our instancer, and I'm going to adjust the Y position. And as I do this, you're going to start to see that this thing is getting rotated around the X axis. Now you may say it's a little bit crooked. Well, that's because our camera, I have not changed any settings there. So let me come to my active camera. And with our active camera selected, I'm going to go to that default camera and I'm going to reset its parameters. Now it looks like these particles are spreading out, and we're going to do some more spreading right here in a moment. But before I do that, I'm just going to take my camera and drag it on out to where I'm on the outside of the particles. So hopefully you do see now how these particles are rotating around the x-axis. The x-axis comes across here in the middle since I have my camera centered, but I only have it pulled back on the position Z. So we're rotating kind of like towards the camera. And to show you this even more, let me come to this modifier. And notice that we do have it set to 360. I'm going to set this back to 0. And when I do that, it's just going to have these particles positioned up. Sure, the scales are different, but as I start to adjust this rotation X, you're going to see that it's going to appear to start wrapping around the X-axis. And I'm just going to drag this on up so you can see it. And now you can clearly see that it is going around the X-axis. And I'm going to do 360 degrees. I'm going to do the same thing to the Y-axis. And for safe measure, let's do the Z as well. So now we have a hot mess. Particles are everywhere, but this is exactly what we want for our explosion. Now, to get the explosion effect, this instancer here, one of the main things we're going to change about this is the scale. Notice as I scale this, these particles are going to scale in, and this is going to give us that explosion effect, but it's going to look even more realistic or cool or whatever you want to call it once we start applying illuminance and once we start messing around with our camera settings. So for now, I'm just going to set this scale to 1. Now I'm going to come to this sphere, I'm going to right click on it, apply material, new material. And the only thing I want to do with this new material is come down to the illuminance, go bump its illuminance on up to about 5. Looks really bright, I know. I'm going to add a color, and I'm going to use some type of red. That's all I want to do for the material. Now, let's go back to the null that the sphere sits inside of. Let's right click on the null and let's duplicate it. So when we duplicate this null, I'm going to go to its illuminance for that material, and I'm going to simply change the color. So now we have some greens and some reds. I'm going to duplicate this one last time. And for this material, I'm going to give it one more different color. Maybe a blue. Now I know this looks really bright, but as we scale it in, it's going to get darker. And before we go any further as well, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and change my background to a solid black. So to quickly do that, I'm going to tap on the inner color and the outer color and set them both to black. Now let's go ahead and start keyframing our instancer. I mentioned a moment ago the instancer, we're going to adjust its scale. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and bump its scale down to 0. I'm going to add a keyframe at the beginning of my timeline. And I actually want it to stay, for right now, I'm going to keep that same scale at 0 up to 60 frames because this project is 120 frames long, 4 seconds, 30 frames per second. But then from 60 to 120, this is where I want the explosion to occur. Well, how much explosion do I want to occur? Since I had the keyframes on, I'm just going to start dragging up on this, and I'm just going to drag it to where a lot of these particles are bursting out onto the screen. Now I think it would be a good idea here to go ahead and set the interpolation to linear. It's going to be a super fast animation, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to bump this on up even higher to somewhere around 6. So I'm just going to put it right around frame 50 so we can see the effect. And there's our explosions. And these are spheres, and with the default camera settings, let's see what they are. Default camera, scrolling on down. This is by default, I haven't changed any of this stuff, but I'm going to apply an old preset to it. And with that motion blur, I think the motion blur is cut almost all the way up. Let's cut it on up to 1. That's going to give it more of a, as these things are popping out, they almost look like capsules, right? But they're spheres. If we put this thing on sharp, you're going to see each individual sphere, and this does not look good. Maybe it does to you, depending on what you want to do. You could get some type of like starry animation or something like that. But I'm going to set this to old. And we can come to the active camera up here and we can adjust these settings as well. I'm going to bump my motion blur on up, and I'm going to come to bloom, and I'm going to make it just a touch brighter. That may look too bright, but This next effect we're getting ready to apply, I mean, right here at the beginning, when it first explodes, it's not that bright because they're not filling up the screen. But as it comes out here, yes, it's really bright. But somewhere maybe around here, around 100 frames, I want these particles to sort of fade out or scale back to small. I guess you can think of it as they're burning out if they're fireworks. So here's how I'm going to do that. At frame 100, I'm going to come back to each individual sphere in the null. I'm going to keyframe the scale, and right now it's set to 1. Then I'm going to scrub on up to the end of my project, and I'm going to set that scale to 0. So we just got rid of one of the particles. Now it's up to you how you want to set this interpolation. I'll just set it to linear. Now we want to come and do this for the other 2 spheres as well that sit inside of those nulls. So I'm at frame 120. I want to set the scale here at 0 at the end of my project. And then I'm just going to go back 20 frames to frame 100. And here's when the scale was 1. Set my interpolation to linear. One more time. So now I'm at frame 100, keyframing the scale of this last sphere, and then at frame 120, I want its scale to be 0. Interpolation, linear. All right, so right now up to frame 60, right here is where the explosion occurs. And it's really bright, and then what's going to happen right here, the particles are going to start burning out. And then it gets dark again. And notice, I think some of them are fading differently, and I think that has something to do with the scale, the modifier. Remember this modifier up here? We do have some scales getting changed. The modify scale uniformly, and I do have that set to 1. So some of these particles are slightly bigger or smaller than others, so maybe they're fading out slightly different. So what about the first 60 frames, the first half of this animation? Nothing's going on until we hit frame 60. Well, what I want to do here, and if you did watch the video closely at the beginning, this instancer was kind of shooting up from the bottom to simulate that explosion of fireworks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the beginning of my project. I'm going to make sure I have my instancer selected. And we did keyframe the scale to be 0. But as a matter of fact, at the very beginning, I want my scale to maybe be somewhere, let's try 0.1. And we can see that. That's pretty good. And I'm going to actually have that scale down to 0. So for the first 60 frames, we're going to see this. And notice it is scaling down to 0 before it pops. But not only that, what I also want to do with my instancer is I want it to animate from the bottom as like if it was shooting off and coming to this spot. And then you'll see the explosion. So a quick keyframe here, I'm going to keyframe this position Y, and I'm just going to drag that Y on down to where this instancer is off the screen. So somewhere around -7 maybe. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, we cannot see the instancer. And then right up here to frame 60, right before the animation pops, I want this position to be back at 0. Now this is one case where maybe a Bezier type of interpolation may be better. So for the position Y, by default, I'm pretty sure this thing's set to Bezier. Nope, it's set to linear, but I'm going to set it to Bezier, and I'm going to tap this one right here. And as this thing is shooting up, imagine if you're watching fireworks. It shoots up fast, and then it starts to decelerate, or the entire time the thing's shooting up, it is decelerating. So I want to have this to concave down, and we can kind of see that effect right there. And I'm going to drag this handle as well. So it's going to be going up, but it's going to be slowing down as it goes up. And to see that, let's scrub the playhead. So it's going up and it's slowing down and scaling, and then boom, we have our explosion. And then we have it exploding, 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 and then they scale out, and that is your animation. So what comes next is taking this project, I'm going to export it. So share, export movie, and I'm just going to go to my render, make sure I have my quality set to best. And we're going to do some post-production in, yes, we're going to do it in ScreenFlow. So I have a new blank document in ScreenFlow, 30 frames per second, 1920 by 1080, the same as my Apple Motion project. I'm going to take this exported movie from Apple Motion, the sphere explosion. I'm going to drag that over, and I'm also going to drag over that audio file. And I'm going to go ahead and add the video and the audio to my timeline. Now sure, I could have edited my audio and the video further in Apple Motion, but I'm very comfortable with ScreenFlow as well, and since I already have a smooth animation here, I know you hear some crazy sounds, that's the audio. I can edit it very fast here, and I don't have to worry about any potential crashes or anything like that. Sure, I'll probably lose some video quality by importing a video, and then I'm going to re-export it again, but I'm not complaining. So I do remember that my Apple Motion project, it was 4 seconds long because it was 120 frames, 30 frames per second. And right around the 2-second mark, I'm going to lower my audio here. Actually going to mute it. And right here, you can see the waveform. Right there is where we get our pop. And the way I made this audio file in GarageBand, that's exactly what's happening. But what I want to do here is I want to have a pause right there. So I'm going to trim the video file. And then I'm going to drag this over a little bit just to have a little pause in there. Just a little pause. And you don't even see the video quality change because it's completely black, so that's fine. That's why I chose that black background. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with that actually. What I would do here on the end of my audio clip, somewhere around maybe close to 5 seconds, I would trim it, delete that part, and then I would fade out at an ending transition. So now I get that audio fading out as it leaves the screen. Not much to do here, but that's the effect that I want, and you can actually find this exported video in that same folder. I'll save it as Explosion, Sphere, ScreenFlow, or something like that. And there you have it, an exploding sphere of fireworks or whatever you want to call it, all made in MO2, and then a little bit of post-production done in ScreenFlow. And that's it for this video. I hope it helped.